Good afternoon, everyone,
Sejam bem-vindos a mais uma sessão
and
da Brasil Water Week,
welcome to
evento da
another
ABRES,
session
Associação
of
Brasileira de
Brazil
Engenharia
Water Week,
Sanitária
an
e
event
Ambiental.
held by the
Nós damos
Brazilian
início à nossa
Association
sessão no
of
desafio da
Sanitary and
universalização do saneamento
Environmental
sob enfoque
Engineering.
dos
Now we
investimentos.
are
Como
starting
alavancar
our session
recursos
on
para
the
o alcance
challenge
das
of
metas do novo marco legal.
sanitation,
Apresento
universal
aqui
access to
os nossos
sanitation, how to leverage
convidados,
resources to achieve the
o
goals of the new
economista
legal
Otaviano
framework.
Canuto,
I would
membro
like to
sênior
now
do
introduce you
Policy
to
Center
our
for the New
speakers,
Thought e membro
Otaviano
sênior não
Canuto,
residente
Senior
da The Brookings Institution,
Fellow at the
o
Policy
professor
Center
Júlio
for the New
Sen,
South and
professor da
Non-Resident
London
Senior
School of
Fellow at the
Economics
Brookings
e da
Institution,
Universidade College
Professor
of
Julian
London, na
Sam,
Inglaterra,
Professor at the London
Tiago Pena
School of
Pereira,
Economics and
especialista
University
sênior em água
College
e
London in
saneamento,
England,
do BID, do
Tiago
Banco
Pena Pereira,
Interamericano de
Senior Water and
Desenvolvimento,
Sanitation Specialist
e
at the
Christian
Inter-American
Borja
Development Bank,
Vega,
and Christian
economista
Borja
sênior do
Veja,
Banco Mundial.
Senior Economist
Obrigado a
at
todos
the
por
World
aceitarem o
Bank.
nosso convite
Thank you
e você que
all
nos
for
acompanha na
accepting our
plataforma
invitation.
pode escolher
And
o
for
idioma
those
da
who are
sua
joining
preferência,
us
basta
online,
acompanhar
you
a
can choose
sessão.
the language of
É
your
só clicar no
preference
botão acima
to
deste
follow
vídeo e
the
escolher
session. All we need to do is click
a
on the
sua
button
preferência em
above this
termos de
video and
idioma.
choose
Para saber mais
the
sobre os
language
especialistas,
of your
acesse a
choice.
área
To
abaixo
learn
desse
more
vídeo
about
e ao
our
final das
experts,
apresentações, todos os nossos
below
convidados
this
terão a
video,
oportunidade de fazer
you will find
comentários,
more
responder
information.
perguntas
At the
e
end
interagir
of
com
all of the
a
presentations, you'll
plateia,
have a
ok?
chance to
E fico
ask
muito agradecido
questions
aos
and
palestrantes,
interact with
agradecido
our
à ABRES,
speakers.
uma grande
I'd like to
oportunidade
thank
de
all of our
discutirmos aí
speakers
a
and
questão do
ABIs as well
financiamento
for
dos
this great opportunity
investimentos
for us to
diante
discuss
de um
funding
desafio
and
enorme aí do novo marco legal
investments
de saneamento.
in light
Chamo
of
agora
a
o
major
professor
challenge
e
presented
economista
by
Otaviano
the
Canuto
new legal
para
framework.
que
I
faça
would like
uso da
now to pass the
palavra
floor to
e
Professor
comece a sua
Otaviano
apresentação.
Canuto
Muito prazer em recebê-lo, Canuto, e fique à
to
vontade, por favor.
give his
A palavra é tua.
presentation. The floor is yours.
Você está sem microfone.
Pronto, agora
Okay,
agora vai.
so now we're on.
É um prazer estar aqui na
It's a
Brazil
pleasure
Water Week.
to be here at the Brazil
E
Water Week.
a minha ideia é
And
fazer
my
uma
main
breve introdução
idea
do
here is to
lado
provide a
mais
brief
macro da questão.
explanation
Na
on the
verdade,
macro
vendo isso
side
como uma espécie
of
de
the issue,
introdução
basically
ao
as
que
an
os meus colegas do
introduction
painel vão apresentar.
as to
E
what
são
my
novidades,
panelists,
serão mais
other
prováveis. Deixa
will
eu só
speak about, my other
consertar uma
panelists.
coisinha aqui.
So
Isso
just
aqui tá
allow me to
errado.
fix something here.
Pois bem, o objetivo, como eu disse,
So the
perdão,
goal,
mas
as I
rapidinho.
stated before,
O que tá vendo aqui, caramba? Desculpem, só um instantinho. Pois bem, como eu disse, a
as I
ideia é
said,
abordar o panorama
the idea
econômico e
is
as
to
perspectivas
address
para investimento em
the
infraestrutura.
economical side and
Vocês
investments.
estão vendo os slides aí, não?
Can you see
Ou
my
tá fora?
slides?
Não estamos vendo, Otaviano.
Tá bom.
We cannot
Vou
see
lá,
your slides.
Vamos lá. Volta, share screen. Pois bem, eu tive a intenção de começar.
I
Perdão, não vai
wish
cheio, vai
to
assim pela
start
metade mesmo. De começar observando, botando números aqui a
addressing
respeito
certain
das
figures
necessidades de
here
investimento em
on the
infraestrutura pelas
needs
quais o Brasil,
for investments and
evidentemente,
infrastructure
está
that Brazil
precisando concluir.
evidently
Vejam, no
needs.
final do meu período no Banco Mundial,
At the end of my
o banco fez
tenure at the
relatório
World Bank,
sobre infraestrutura
the bank devised a report on infrastructure
e constatou como
and
os
found
investimentos em infraestrutura se mantiveram na média
that investments
acima de
in
5% do
infrastructure
PIB entre as
remained
décadas de
at an average of
1920
above
e 80,
5% of
mas nas
GDP.
duas últimas décadas
However,
anteriores
in
ao
the
relatório, o
other
ritmo de
2
investimento
decades
tinha
prior
caído
to
para
the
menos
report,
de
investments
2,5% do
fell
PIB,
to lower than 2% of the GDP. So this
do mínimo
volume is lower
necessário
than the minimum threshold required
para a manutenção da
for
infraestrutura.
maintaining
Uma
the
situação
infrastructure.
grave,
So this is a
inclusive,
dire
porque
situation
Não é apenas que o atual estoque de infraestrutura física no Brasil,
because the current
proporção do PIB,
infrastructure in
hoje é
Brazil,
menor que
due
da maior parte dos
the
países disponíveis
GDP,
comparáveis de renda.
GDP today is
Certo?
lower than many
E
other
é importante frisar,
countries, but it's
como
important
fez o
to
relatório,
find out, as
embora o
Antonio
acesso
stated,
à eletricidade
that although
e
access to
telecomunicações tenha
energy
melhorado
and
na década de 90,
telecommunications has improved since
o
the
saneamento
90s,
básico, além,
basic
evidentemente, das redes de transportes,
sanitation
estão muito aquém daquela dos países,
is
né?
really falling behind
Mesmo quando
these
se
other
leva em
realms.
conta
Even
a
if we
expressão
take into
territorial e
account
a
the
densidade
continental
populacional
size
relativamente baixa do
Brazil
país. Pois bem,
and low
e essa
population
insuficiência de
density of
investimentos,
Brazil.
a
So this
infraestrutura vem trazendo
inefficiency
custo
in
em termos de pior
investments
desempenho da
has been
produtividade, e
leading to
problema de crescimento.
consequences in
Lembro
productivity.
bem de trabalho feito pelo Banco Mundial
I recall
sobre por que
a
a
report by the
soja
World
brasileira tinha
Bank
ficado tão
on
competitiva
why
no
Brazil
início
has
dos anos
become
2000, logo quando eu tinha acabado
competitive
chegando
in
no Banco
the
Mundial,
start of
e
the
o relatório do
2000s, and
banco
the
disse que aquilo
report
estava ocorrendo a
stated
despeito do
that
fato de que
that happened
30%
in
da
spite
produção
of
de soja brasileira
30% of
estava sendo desperdiçada,
production of
jogada no lixo,
sodium of
por conta de
Brazil
falta de
was being
condições de
wasted
armazenamento
due
e
to
de
proper
transporte e logística.
storage
Então, o país
conditions.
paga um preço por essa
So the
carência de
country pays a high price for this lack of investments.
investimento de infraestrutura, não é só nos
In
transportes.
infrastructure,
Para você
not
ter uma
only
ideia,
in transports, for you to have an
essa
idea,
compressão de gastos
this
públicos em
compression
infraestrutura
in
se
public
deu enquanto a despesa
infrastructure
pública
expenses took place while
crescia 2%
public
acima do PIB.
expenses
E os
increased
gastos
2%
primários
over the
do
GDP,
governo, como
while
proporção do
basic
PIB,
expenses of the
subiram de
government
22% em
increased from
1991 para
22% in 91
36% lá para meados
to
da década passada. Quer
36%
dizer,
in the
nós
last decade.
é o
So
que eu já chamei em certos
it's what I have already alluded
trabalhos de
to in other
obesidade do setor público brasileiro,
jobs as the obesity of the
agravando e
Brazilian public
provocando uma
sector,
anemia da produtividade.
aggravating
Gasta muito,
and
mas
worsening
quando se
the
leva em conta
productivity
a necessidade
of
de
the
investimentos em
country,
infraestrutura, gasta mal. Tá?
especially when we need
Isso
to have more
é o que não pode ser perdido de
investments
vista
in infrastructure.
por nós nessa
So we
análise.
need to
Pois bem,
take
é
into
evidente
this
que o novo marco
account.
legal do saneamento
So the new sanitation legal
enorme
framework
avanço
is a
que nos
huge
permite, digamos,
advance
ter otimismo e
that
os números
allows
estão
us
mostrando como
to
já
really make
aparecem
headway in this sector, as we can
intenções de
see
investimento
in the figures here for
significativas,
intended
mas
investments, which
é
are
só
significant.
o meio,
However,
começo de uma
this is
estrada
just
tem
the
dito que é longa,
start
né?
of a long
Pois
path
bem,
ahead.
naquilo que diz respeito
In
aos
the
condicionantes
regard
macroeconômicos, eu estou de olho
of
no relógio,
macroeconomic
não se preocupe.
conditions, and I have my eye here
Vale a pena a
on the
gente dar
on the
uma
on the
passada
watch
aqui
because of
nos
time
diversos
constraints.
mecanismos pelos
I think it's
quais
worth for us to
a
take a look
macroeconomia
at the
afeta
main
o
mechanisms
retorno
here
e
which impact the
o retorno
returns
prospectivo de investimento em infraestrutura.
of investments
É
in
evidente
infrastructure.
que taxas de
It's
juros
clear
que
that
dependem da
interest
inflação
rates
importam muito,
are very important, also
não
because of
simplesmente
due
a
to
taxa
inflation,
básica
not only the
Selic, definida
basic
pelo Banco
Selic
Central, mas
rate
a
defined
taxa
by the Central Bank of
acrescida
Brazil,
dos
but also
prêmios de
the rate
risco e
added
prêmios
with
temporais
premium
que,
risks
com os quais se chega às
with
taxas de
which
juros
we reach
que servem de referência para
interest
descontar
rates which serve
fluxo de
as
retorno
benchmark
em investimentos de infraestrutura.
for
Né?
infrastructure
E nesse
investments to
sentido,
be made. And to that end,
evidentemente que não estamos no pior dos mundos,
we're
como já
not
estivemos,
in
mas
the worst
não
case
deixa de ser
as
desafio
we were
o
before,
fato
but
de
it's
que,
nonetheless a
pelo
challenge
menos, nós estamos vendo uma
because at
estabilidade
least
financeira
we are seeing certain financial
mas
stability now,
com condições financeiras, como
but
vocês
with
veem no gráfico à direita,
financial conditions, as you see
não
in the
perfeitamente
graph to the
favorável.
right-hand
Né?
side,
Pois bem, é claro
which
que
are still lacking.
isso se deve e dependerá exatamente
This
da
will be
evolução da
conditional
inflação.
upon the evolution of
Vocês
the
têm
inflation in
isso
Brazil.
aqui é algo sensível. Vocês
And this
vejam
is
como
sensitive because
no gráfico à
you can
direita,
see in the chart to your right-hand side
as próprias expectativas
how
quanto à
the
inflação e
expectations
taxas
and
de juros
predictions
sofreram
on interest rates
consequências de ruídos provenientes de sinais de
inflation
fora e
suffered
dentro.
impacts from
Mas o
noise
fato é que
and rumors, but the fact stands
temos
that
que torcer para que,
we really
de uma
need
maneira ou outra, aquilo que subjaz o prêmio de risco
to to root, let's say, for the public Brazilian security bonds to fall, to decrease on their levels, as well as other factors to benefit investments. So the fiscal condition is key. And one of the points that I made in the issue in the beginning is growth. Of course, growth opens fiscal and tributary and income received. However, this influences the outcome of growth itself. We can see through this chart here. This is a challenging issue. We are not currently in an explosive trajectory of public debt. Nonetheless, we will still have to deal in the future with a higher public debt, which isn't disastrous, but which will have impacts, also on interest rates. So this public debt that we can see imposes certain challenges in the upcoming future, but the fact stands that, as I showed in the previous chart, we don't have an explosive trajectory, but the fiscal space that we have in Brazil isn't really significant. So that is why it's important to bolster what I said, that we need to reassess public expenses and what Brazil spends on actually. And these investments were not followed in the last decades with investments in infrastructure, did not correspond. So here we can see the GDP in balance terms, and here the exchange rate. This is, of course, a concerning variable which has an impact, but we really, as a matter of fact, we don't concern ourselves very much with this side, even though incomes have current debts nowadays, although Brazil has an increasing balance. The fact stands that investments have been more than enough to cover these needs for financing the current balance and reserve funds. So we do have an evolution, as you can see, and credit default swaps, which are favorable. The balance of payments and exchange rate isn't a matter of concern. Okay, quickly looking here at regulation, which also we made headway in terms of regulation. Before that, however, let me just briefly touch upon something that my peer panelists here will expand more on, but which is the concept of crowding in private investments. You can, for instance, see infrastructure investments as a chain with different stages and milestones, which do apply substantially when it comes to infrastructure. And the idea is that even though the private sector feels more comfortable to operate in some of these project stages, the concept is that public support and from public institutions such as the World Bank, the IDB, instead of focusing on funding the whole investment itself, these institutions should use their authority to perhaps offer coverage for certain risks with which the private sector is not really suited to operate with or really available to operate. And perhaps upon covering these specific risks, the credit institutions can thus be able to multiply and join together private capital. So this is something that we should keep an eye on, different projects. But in this report that I conducted before. We provide several examples of how you can offer different types of selective risk coverages and thereby enhance the partnership between the private and public sectors. So that is what I had to say.
Obrigado, Otaviano.
Thank
Sensacional
you,
essa sua visão. É
Otaviano.
sempre
That
muito,
was
muito
very
importante para
interesting,
que
your
todos
outlook on the
aprendam, né,
matter,
sobre um
for
pouco
everyone to
esse ambiente
learn a bit
macroeconômico,
more
sobre
about the
essa
macroeconomic
realidade que você está
side
colocando aqui de o Brasil
to
gastar pouco e
this
gastar muito, né?
situation
Achei muito
whereby Brazil
interessante quando você
spends little and
cita a
spends
obesidade do setor público. Eu não
badly.
tinha ouvido ainda
I had never
essa,
heard this term
essa,
obesity of the public
essa
sector, but I
frase,
found it very
esse enquadramento aí do setor
pertaining
público. Achei muito
because
interessante.
it does
E
apply.
também
Macro obesity of the public sector,
que
which
gera
was, let's
pandemia,
say,
exatamente.
what
Muito
generates actually
interessante. Mas acho que
a
essa última
lack,
colocação sobre o espaço
deficiency.
fiscal, da
But your
própria,
last
o
point
papel
on
da
the fiscal
arrecadação tributária
space
e da dívida
and
pública,
on
etc.
collecting
E
debt,
também do papel dos
public
agentes
debt, and also the
financiadores como
role
IDB,
of
BNDES,
financiers
etc.,
such
nessa
as
cobertura de riscos
IDB and
chave. Acho que
BNDES
isso é
in
uma
covering
grande ideia.
key
Isso
risks. I think
é
this is a major
realmente
concept,
insight bem bacana
and
para
this is a
inspirar aí
major
o setor público e
insight to
setor,
inspire the
basicamente,
public
de
sector,
infraestrutura e saneamento no Brasil,
specifically
alavancar
for
recursos, sem dúvida nenhuma.
infrastructure in Brazil
Parabéns
to
aí mais uma
leverage
vez e muito
funds. So
obrigado
once again, congratulations and
aguarde que
thank you
virão
very
muitos
much.
comentários aí,
And
certamente, para você responder.
I'm sure
Tá
you will
certo?
receive a
Mais uma
lot
vez,
of
muito obrigado aí
comments
pela
because of
participação e
your
por
very
aceitar nosso
interesting
convite
ponderations.
gentilmente aí.
So thank you
Bom,
again
eu vou
for
passar
accepting
agora
our
para
invitation. And so now
as
I'll
palavras
hand
do
the
professor
word
Júlio
over
Sen,
to Professor
que é
Julie
professor da
Singh,
London School of
who is
Economics e
professor
da
at the London
University
School
College of
of
London,
Economics and
que
London
tive a oportunidade de já
College of
assistir palestras do
London. I
professor, a última
already
recente,
attended a
inclusive, e tem uma
lecture of
grande
the
experiência
professor
aí na área
recently.
internacional, na Inglaterra
He has
principalmente.
a
Com a
lot of
palavra, professor
expertise,
Júlio, fique à
especially
vontade. Boa
in
tarde,
the United
obrigado mais uma vez
Kingdom.
também pela
So once
participação.
again, Professor, thank you again for participating. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ju. And first of all, I do apologize for struggling with the technology and joining the program joining the session a little bit late. I apologize especially to Ottaviano. I was able to see the slides, but I wasn't able to catch the whole session. So I do hope what I say won't overlap too much with what has been covered. What I would like to highlight, if I may, within the limited time we have, are a few points which I think are relevant when we look at the issues from an international perspective. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware there's a lot of investment finance available in the global system. In fact, there is a huge amount of investment finance that can be channelized if appropriate policy frameworks are put in place into priority areas like infrastructure. The problem, of course, is risk of various sorts and whether the projects are viable. Now, how do we unlock this potential? When we think specifically about the Brazilian requirements in the water and sanitation sectors, one way of thinking about it is to identify the scale of the requirements. So even if we are not particularly accurate about how much is needed, it's probably in excess of 20 or 30 billion dollars a year for the next 10 or 20 years. That is a significant amount of money. 200 to 300 billion dollars equivalent. However, it's not a huge amount of money when assessed from an international investor perspective. It's actually quite small. Tesla probably solicits and gets equivalent amounts of money from year to year. And that's just one enterprise. However, Brazil's priorities relate to a social sector, relate to an infrastructure sector related to social priorities, and therefore the assessments of risks are different than, say, for Tesla. So there is a lot of money available, but the key question is, how do we access this? And the key consideration from the investor perspective is risk. Investors are prepared and happy to pump in huge amounts of money, but they need to cover their risks. And when we talk about risks, these are risks related to the project, financial risks, etc., etc. But they are also political risks. Now, as Ottaviano and others have said, Brazil's fiscal situation is a bit tight, and its ability to guarantee loans are limited. Now, if you consider Brazil as federal entity, of course, we understand that, but also consider the individual states within Brazil. They have their own severe constraints. So accessing massive amounts of capital with limited fiscal capacity is difficult. What then can be done? From experience, from European examples, from the way in which other countries work, perhaps a route can be explored through the way in which states offer guarantees. Now, when we think of guarantees, we assume that by guaranteeing a risk or covering a risk, we are covering all the costs associated with the risks. But the way in which guarantees work in the main are conditional. Conditional on the failure of a project, conditional on situations within the project management or the project environment changing, conditional on financial parameters changing, say interest rates, etc. So they are not guarantees that will generally require that the full amount that is sought to be guaranteed has to be paid back to the investors. It is usually a percentage, a proportion, a small amount. Now, states often offer guarantees well beyond their capacity to pay. The United States is the best example. And indeed, many other advanced economies offer state guarantees well beyond their ability to pay. What matters in that situation is the credibility of the political commitment of the government. And where the US is concerned, for example, all debts are guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States. Now, this means, in effect, that the US will honor all its debts. The same is generally true for most advanced economies. The difficulty that Brazil faces specifically is curiously regional. The way investors look at the world is not quite the same way in which you and I would generally look at issues. Investors will see South America, and within South America, they will see Argentina and Brazil and 20 or 30 other countries, some of which have a very poor record in debt management. Now, Brazil defaulted on its debt obligations in the late 1980s, and this is remembered by the investor community. For example, the US has never defaulted on its debts. The UK has never defaulted on its debts. Many countries in the world, around the world, have never defaulted on their debt obligations. But Brazil, unfortunately, had one moment in time where they defaulted. Argentina frequently defaults. So the way investors will look at Brazil is to think about the region, the culture, the system, etc., and calculate the risks. So for a country like Brazil, it's important to establish that their culture, their approach is very different from that of their neighbors like Argentina, so that investors don't feel that the region itself is compromised. The second thing is that these guarantees have to be meaningful. It's not enough to simply say it's a guarantee. It has to be materialized in the event of risks. And that brings us back to an issue which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The project design has to be carefully considered with reference to investor perspectives, of course, but also with reference to the policy objectives. Now, the policy objectives, which we've discussed, which we've talked about many times, are simple and straightforward. Brazil has to be covered by 100% water and sanitation facilities. This implies a government commitment. So one level of government commitment is with reference to loan guarantees. Another is with reference to underwriting the costs of marginal infrastructure projects. And when I say marginal, I mean in commercial terms. So Brazil has a vast geography, a large number of communities isolated and finding it difficult to access water and sanitation. And to extend this reality to the whole geography of Brazil will require huge government subsidies. So you have guarantees against loan risks, but you also need subsidies against operational and cost-related issues. Now, these subsidies have to then cover all the population categories which cannot on their own meet the commercial costs of water and sanitation. They also have to cover the geographic realities of a vast country. This number, whatever it is important to investors. And that number matters when investors consider the level of risk over a period of 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. Once that number is clear, it's relatively easy for international investors to factor in government subsidies as a given guarantee, but also to factor in how best to manage the project. Now, what international investors will then think about, and this is something we can hopefully we can talk about later, is how can we make money out of this? In other words, how can we generate a return on the investment which justifies our borrowing from international markets, etc., etc. And that comes from this combination of guarantees. State guarantees about infrastructure spending relating to marginal communities, geographically isolated centers, etc., and the risks relating to the loan itself. Once these are combined together, it's fairly easy for investors to assess whether this is viable or not viable. The second level of consideration, which they will take into account, is, okay, I can invest in Brazil, but I can also use my money to invest in something else in Africa or Asia or anywhere else in the world. It could be to do with minerals. it could be to do with consumer products, it could be to do with tourism, etc. So there has to be a message conveyed through these arrangements which favors investment in long-term infrastructure projects, specifically in Brazil, over other options. Now, that's much harder to organize. But the good news is many international investors are looking for long-term projects. And the short-term commercial projects, which have dominated global growth models for the last 20 or 30 years, have now given way to these long-term perspectives. Now, whether you talk about Warren Buffett in the United States and his long-term investing strategies, or institutional investors from insurance companies and pension funds, they are looking for long-term investments, but obviously long-term investments with a secure return. And so if this is aligned properly, and this is a very political issue, then it can be effective. Now, capacity, and on previous occasions I've talked about this. We can generate a lot of money into investments, but the institutions, the organizations, the companies, the engineering capacity has to be able to handle this. Now, Brazil is curiously different from many other countries in that some areas have very, very advanced and competent institutions which can manage projects. But there are some areas in Brazil which are really quite isolated and find this difficult. So building institutional and organizational and engineering capacity is also part of this general approach. What can the government do in that situation is assure, within the policy framework which Edu has highlighted and Octaviani has illustrated, long-term political and fiscal commitments to meeting these equity issues. And when I say equity, I mean exactly what I was referring to earlier, the capacity of some areas within the system to respond, to build and invest. And of course, that capacity has to be vastly increased. So it's important for the Brazilian government to present a very, very long-term perspective on this whole issue and very, very specific guarantees relating to loan issues and guarantees further relating to the social agenda, meeting equity and inequality issues, but also capacity issues. Now, we think when we stand back and look at this, it's very difficult. But frankly speaking, once the Brazilian government has committed to this, it is actually quite simple. It just means backing the commitment with fiscal resources. Now, we're aware, of course, that fiscal resources are constrained. They're not unrestricted. However, they have to somehow be identified. Now, why should this be a dominant priority within the Brazilian political framework is pretty straightforward. Good water and sanitation and sewage supply enhances the health and well-being of people everywhere. It also increases the efficiency and functionality of business. So the multiplier consequences, the multiplier effect of a government commitment to significantly enhancing water, sanitation, and sewage supplies will, over time, generate far more economic activity than we can imagine. If I can put it in terms which may not be relevant to Brazil, but we can understand very clearly. When the US launched the Interstate Highway Program in the 1950s, they could not, and it was done, those of you who are familiar with this would know, from a Defense Department perspective. In other words, the US Department of Defense actually built or guaranteed or underwrote the interstate highway system in the United States. For every $1 spent, it has, according to current assessments, generated $6 in economic activity, a 600% return on an infrastructure idea relating to roads and bridges. Water and sanitation, probably, I don't know the numbers, has a much greater multiplier effect. And I would use the example of Singapore to illustrate how profound this can be. Singapore in 1962, before it became independent, had a per capita income lower than India. Today, it has a per capita income higher than the United States. At the heart of the Singaporean strategy was slum clearance, water, and sanitation. The multiplier effect of a healthy population, of a fit population, of a population that can go to school and absorb the skills that education offers, is enormous. So I can very clearly see the massive, massive commitments on behalf of the state of Brazil as a federal entity, on behalf of the states within Brazil as states within a complex federal system, have a huge, huge multiplier effect in economic terms. In social terms, of course, this is even bigger. Employment, skills.
Julio, sorry. I'm so sorry. We need to finish your presentation, please, because of the time. I'm so sorry.
Sure. So I will conclude by saying, when we consider the multipliers, these are not simply economic, they are social and commercial as well. So the level and commitment, the level of commitment the Brazilian state will matter enormously, whether it's in terms of guarantees or subsidies or long-term commitments. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, professor Júlio. Mais uma vez, mil perdões.
Thank you
Desculpas
very
aí por
much,
interromper a sua
Professor
belíssima apresentação e
Julius.
explanação.
It's
Foi
really a
realmente
shame
muito
for me
enriquecedora
to
para nós
interrupt your
trazer essas
presentation, so
experiências,
beautifully
trazer as ideias
delivered,
aí
and to hear
de
your
transformação e
ideas and
mudanças e melhorias aí
experiences
nas formas
to
de garantia.
drive
Achei muito
change
interessante.
and
A gente aqui
transformation
no Brasil
in the
discute
form
muito
of
em PPPs,
guarantees.
parcerias
You know, in Brazil,
público-privadas,
we're often
concessões,
discussing
processos de
PPPs,
desestatização,
concessions,
etc. A questão
and
das garantias e fundos
reduction
garantidores
of
e
the state and
mecanismos e
other
estratégias
mechanisms and
mais modernas,
strategies
diferenciadas,
that are
sobre a
different
questão das
from
garantias.
the
Então,
ones we used
é
in the
tema
past to
absolutamente
provide
relevante. E uma outra
guarantees.
coisa que eu
So
destacaria
this is a
rapidamente da sua
highly relevant
apresentação,
topic,
que
and
você comentou
allow
sobre a
me
modelagem do
just
projeto,
to
né? É
highlight
muito importante
that
a gente
in your
saber da modelagem
presentation,
do
you
projeto. O senhor tem
talked
toda a
about
razão.
project
É
modeling. It's
importantíssimo
extremely
conhecermos esses
important. I
projetos
agree with you.
e, né, em
We
toda a
have
sua
to
amplitude, em
get
toda a
to
sua
know these
abrangência, para que
projects
exatamente
in
possamos,
all of
né,
its
optar por os melhores
of their
caminhos aí
depth
na questão
and
dos
scope, so
financiamentos
that
e
we can
atração de
choose
investimentos
the
para esses
best
projetos.
strategies to
Parabéns
attract
mais uma vez, muito
investment
obrigado.
and obtain
E agora eu
funding. So
chamaria
thank
o
you very
Tiago Pena
much.
Pereira,
And now
que é
let's
especialista
hear
sênior em água e
Tiago
saneamento do
Pena
BID, o Banco
Pereira.
Interamericano
He
de
is
Desenvolvimento, para
the
fazer uso da
water and
palavra. Por favor,
sanitation
Tiago, boa
expert
tarde.
from
Mais uma vez,
IDB.
obrigado pela
So
participação.
thank you very much, Professor,
Boa
for
tarde, Luiz. Boa
participating.
tarde
Thank you,
aos demais
Luis.
palestrantes e a
Thank you
todos os
to
ouvintes
my
dessa
fellow
sessão.
speakers and all of
Eu vou começar aqui minha
those who
apresentação.
are
Deixa eu
listening
colocar aqui no modo
to our
apresentação.
session. Let me just share the
Luiz,
presentation
minha
before I
internet está
start.
oscilando um pouquinho, mas está voltando
Unfortunately,
rápido aqui.
my connection is a bit
Então,
choppy, so
vamos lá.
I hope I don't
Bom,
get cut off. My name is Thiago Pena. I am from IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and I work in the Water and Sanitation Division. My intention is to share with you some information on how the IDB funds the sanitation sector in Brazil. Well, just a few words about IDB, our portfolio of projects in Brazil, our support to innovation and water funds. The IDB is a multilateral development bank. Let me underscore development here. If you ask any of my colleagues how much was the bank's income last year, 90% of them will not be able to answer this question. But our purpose is to fund viable economic, social, institutional development projects besides promoting social integration in the region. We have 48 member countries. 22 are not members. They are located in or they do not take loans. And we have the other half that can take loans with the IDB. We have 10 institutions in our, we have the so-called public bid, then we have the private branch financing the private sector, and also bid lab focusing on innovation and startups.
Nossa divisão de acionamento que a gente chama tem alguns objetivos estratégicos, um deles é o acesso.
Our water and sanitation division has a few strategic objectives, always with a focus on climate resilience and environmental resilience, and also additionally water security. Within this framework, just to give you a few more details, for us, access is something that, should also include not only a more universal access, but also a green infrastructure, resilience. We have a deeper perspective on things. We also finance several initiatives related to energy losses and energy deficiencies. We invest in institutional strengthening to drive sustainability a long time, always with the participation of population. All of our work starts with a public consultation with a focus on inclusion, biodiversity, both in companies and communities, especially vulnerable ones. And digital transformation is another hallmark of what we do.
An example of one of our projects, just to give you an idea of what sanitation means to us. We work on the four pillars of sanitation in Brazil: drainage, water and wastewater systems, and other important pillars. We have a project that's so-called the integral sanitation. This picture at the top is a real picture. We have a house on stilts with solid waste and wastewater. It's not enough just to go there and create a floating network. We have to have a holistic approach. We resettle some families so that we can improve their health conditions, improve also gender equality in other areas. Here we are talking about more drainage, investment in water and drainage, urbanization, parks, roads. So we are talking about many different actions that must be taken so that we can have full sanitation for our population. To the right, we can see some impacts. For example, we have the reduction in waterborne diseases. And we have some examples of public works that were funded. So water supply networks, resettlements, reforestation projects. These are some examples of projects that we financed in the states, in Amazonas states. Another example is in the Tietê River. It was quite an emblematic event. This project is focused on the expansion of wastewater treatment services. We have been working with Sabesp since the beginning of the 90s. At the bottom, we have an illustration showing how our coverage has progressed since 1991. We haven't been the sole funder, but I believe that we were the primary funder of this project. And we've seen real positive impacts on rivers and also the livelihood of people as well. We have the Tietê 4 project where we funded the creation of wastewater services. This is an example of a project in the municipality of Joinville. In this case, the municipality is the borrower and also the executor. I brought some examples showing different strategies, but this one has the municipality as the borrower. This is a project focused on drainage, but we also have investments in the wastewater network, urbanization, parks, and also institutional strengthening. This was a very broad project. I just want to show you a little bit the portfolio of our water and wastewater service portfolio. We are present in five regions in the country. We have a special focus on the northern region. We have projects in Pará and in Amazonas states. We have two projects in the northeast, and we have some other projects in other regions of the country. It's a very diversified portfolio. And to the right, we can see the division of the value that has been invested. We also have another mechanism to support the sanitation sector. We have technical cooperations, which are donations. We call them funding, but they are actually donations focused on intellectual works. We finance public policies and management tools. We are funding, for example, many of the regulatory standards created by the National Water Agency in Brazil. We also finance innovation in water and sanitation areas and many different instruments that foster innovation in the water and sanitation sector in Brazil. We also finance other cooperations to foster knowledge sharing, so technical notes, technical visits, knowledge transfer programs, and we also use technical cooperations to prepare lines of credits or different loans, instruments for areas where these infrastructure projects will be implemented. Regarding innovation, we believe that if the innovation does not happen in the sector, we're not very likely to achieve our goals. We must innovate. Sectors that don't innovate will lag behind somehow. There is a need for investment here. Professor Julius talked about this, and Kanoto talked about this as well. So innovating is key. And innovating where? Well, we must innovate in the ecosystem as a whole, not only within a utility, but we must innovate when it comes to our commercial areas, the administrative areas, social area, and other areas. So the whole ecosystem. Innovating is key in our opinion, and is also an investment because through innovation we can reduce expenses and increase our revenue. So it is an investment. We have the objective of contributing to the development of innovation in service providers. We want to improve knowledge. We want to use planning tools. We want to apply innovative tools, and we want to scale up our solutions. We also want to create and improve the governance and the culture in different institutions to support innovation. And we also want to drive digital transformation. There are some details of this specific technical cooperation to promote innovation, but I will skip that for now. And I will speak very briefly about the water funds, which are very important means to funding this sector. In this case, we have the objective of addressing water security. This is a very important problem. We know that we must protect our water sources. We have data showing that 90% of cities are losing vegetation coverage and basins, and this is something that you all know. And of course, there are some other solutions, such as nature-based solution that we want to promote. We also want to have better farming practices. We want to recover riverside communities and areas, and these are some solutions that we have. Well, thinking now about the water fund and the added value that it brings to the table, we are working together with many different stakeholders. We also have a long-term vision, and we also focus on public policies and governance and knowledge and science. That was the path that we took for the creation of the water fund. We first have a feasibility study, then we created per se in a more formalized manner using different strategies. We also create a working plan, and during the operation phase, we execute the projects per se, and then after a while, we measure the performance of this fund and then consolidate your data to ensure its viability in the long term. It's important to make it clear. We must ensure the feasibility of water funds in the long term. Regarding our impact, well, this shows what we have been doing so far. We have 26 water funds where the IDB supervises and manages the funds. We have many different funds in Brazil. More than 300 hectares have been preserved. We have many different partners in the public and private sectors, and also we partner with the civil. We have over 100,000 families who benefited from these projects. So these water funds can be very good alternatives to support the water and sanitation sector in Brazil. This is a movement that is being replicated in many different continents worldwide. Well, I know I spoke really fast and I apologize, but I know that we don't have much time for our discussion. So anyway, thank you. And I will be here if you have any questions or if you want to learn more about the work that we do at the IDB. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tiago. And thank you for sharing your presentation. IDB experiences are very important for us. You have been working here in Brazil in a very robust manner. We can see with the projects that you presented and all of the projects that have been funded by the IDB. You showed your portfolio, you had a focus on innovation that was really nice. And I'm sure that a lot of people now are interested in learning more about water funds. Personally, I definitely want to know more and learn more about water funds. This sounds very interesting. It's a very cool, I would say, strategy for us to have greater access and greater efficiency as well. So I was actually very surprised when I saw the numbers of beneficiaries that you shared with us. So congratulations once again. We have more than 300 people joining us in this session, so we have some questions here in the chat box. But before we we address these questions. I would like to pass the floor to Christian. Christian is a senior economist at the World Bank. Christian, good afternoon. And once again, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours. Thank you, Luis. Can you hear me?
Ouvimos bem.
Yeah. Now, can I share my screen?
Fique à vontade.
Yeah, of course.
Perfeito, já estamos vendo já. Perfeito.
Great. So, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here sharing this panel with all of you. I will be sharing some recent data and the new financing scheme is created by the World Bank. My presentation will be divided into two parts. It will be a very brief presentation. The first part, I will be talking about some of the findings from a report called Water for Shared Welfare, which was presented during the World Economic Forum in Indonesia. And in the second part, we'll talk about the importance of what we found in this report and how we should prioritize our investments in the sector. Now, with the current economic situation that Ottaviano and my other colleagues described really well, I'll show you what the bank does to help investments in the sector. So this will be the structure of my presentation. So just very briefly, we do have a new Water Matters for Shared Prosperity framework. We believe that water and wastewater services are crucial. And when it comes to water resource management, we must definitely look at that in a world where we have climate change. We want to focus on human capital, financial capital, social capital, and natural capital. These are important pillars. So from this analytical framework perspective, we have been trying to create justifications as to why the sector is so important for the economy and as well as for the natural sector and also for human capital. In developing countries, what we see is that they disproportionately rely on water-intensive sectors for employment. More than 56% of jobs in low-income countries rely on water-intensive sectors, compared to 20% of jobs in high-income countries. So we have a reality that where we see that the sector is generating jobs in countries such as Brazil, but we see that many countries are water abundant as Brazil, so we must invest in these sectors to improve efficiency and also improve the management of water resources, because this will help in the expansion of services to vulnerable populations. So why is it important for us to be discussing that? Water stress, which is the lack of balance between supply and demand, will only increase as climate change intensifies and as our population grows and with greater consumption patterns and pollution. In Latin America, unfortunately, we will see that water resources will become more scarce. We predict a reduction of over 44% per capita in renewable water resources. This, of course, will create new conditions. And of course, this also shows how important it is for us to have more robust investments. We see that water resources are very important for the farming sector. Water stress is going to become greater, future is going to be even worse, and we will need more effective and efficient investments that will need to be better well integrated. One of our colleagues talked about how we must have a holistic approach in our investments so that we can provide better quality services. So this slide shows the gaps in access to wash are wide across income groups. This is especially true in low-income countries, and this generates a lot of economic costs. If investments are not done now, if we wait for these gaps to widen throughout time, we will have much higher costs that we will incur to expand access to these services. In low-income areas, we see that more people are without wash access every year since 2000. So if we look at basin regions where we have high poverty levels, coverage probably hasn't improved. So in areas where we have very high levels of poverty, we don't see a progress regarding coverage. And this, of course, generates high economic costs. Children, for example, school-age children in 147 countries were affected by extreme wet shocks lasting an average of 1.8 months per year. And the capacity of these children when they are forced to deal with such events, the capacity to learn of these children will definitely reduce. We see that in Latin America and in Peru, these events are becoming more common. So in Brazil, we must promote investment in infrastructure. What we see is that historical investments in infrastructure, particularly in water in Brazil, have been low compared to other countries, even in Latin America. So the spirit of the new legal framework was to create better conditions and so that we could attract investments. And our colleagues during their previous presentations, such as Ottaviano and Julius and others, talked about these conditions that will probably remain. In the World Bank now we have a new framework where we want to focus on two fundamental aspects to facilitate access to funding by the water and wastewater, water and sanitation sector. First of all, we want to focus on private sector expertise mobilization so that we can find solutions to better integrate within the water and sanitation sector. We also want to focus on management of risks. And of course, this will require private capital mobilization.
We don't have capacity in developing countries. Only the private sector will provide this to universalize access. We had a report that was produced 2 or 3 weeks ago in which it specified that the expenses in sanitation around the globe only amount to 5% of the GDP. So this is very low. If you take into account basic education or health, then these have 6 or even 7% of the GDP investments, but this does not apply to water and sanitation. So we really need to enhance this. And to do this, we need to have certain conditions to provide funds. In the future, we will increasingly need guarantees, as Professor mentioned, and we also need other tools that we may be able to use, such as concessions to allure the private sector, and which are long-term projects with lower risks when it comes to income. So that is the key that can enable the expansion of investments in this sector, particularly in Brazil. We also have involvement with other financiers through platforms in Brazil to enhance and promote investments. So Brazil has a legal framework, which is good. However, it can improve to provide for a larger capacity of credits invested, but also to provide higher clarity regarding risks whenever an investment is made by private entities. And to that end, banks have several departments and branches, such as private sector, which promote bankability, also transaction services regarding the private sector, or risk evaluation at the subnational level. Or, for instance, we also have in our treasury at the bank, we have assessment of risks and securities and guarantees with the expansion of investments, as well as sustainability bonds and contingent financing. So all of these instruments comprise the new legal framework, which we devised last year. There are a lot of countries that are deeply interested in enforcing this milestone as different platforms, particularly when it comes to funding or mitigating or reducing risks, in addition to risks in which agreements with the private sector tend to be more efficient to add for these elements as well. We also need to acknowledge in this framework which types of restrictions or hurdles the private sector may face. And the first one, is most important one, is that we have a continuous sub-value of water. If we cannot value water with its productive and economic uses, it won't be possible to really have a realistic assessment with sound investments and earnings. And this also implies a lack of compliance, subsidies that are, and also exchange rates would apply to this interest rate, So first and foremost, it's important to have an appraisal of water. Second, we have a lack of service providers in several countries, including Brazil. Water and sanitation companies face a restricted financial feasibility. However, the bank can help to this end, providing assistance. In addition to fostering financial and technical efficiency, to prepare these water and sanitation companies to receive both public and private sector investments. And oftentimes, there aren't baseline cornerstones in place, such as income confirmation, and these are required for these investments. But it also needs to have a political influence at both local and state levels for all these policies and strategies to be implemented effectively, and also to overcome these hurdles and bottlenecks that I referenced to. There are also two further key elements, which is how to restructure the multiple risks that a public-private partnership faces. And this is key to reducing risks as well as improving the risks under these agreements. And this also has to do with having in place very clear and defined plans which have a long-term prospects, providing for what to do with different involved stakeholders in these types of operations. And so this consequently leads to an increasingly sustainable framework in this field, which provides quality services with tariffs and rates that actually convey the actual value of water, and which also endeavor to internalize the demand and offer of water within these efficiency systems. So this provides assurance for investors and shareholders with respect to more conventional types, as we can see in blue on the left-hand side. They are only responsible for restrictively constraining officers. So this new system has this difference in place, and for this we have three main pillars to facilitate these financial conditions and also for allowing for investments. Firstly, we must have a plan for financial sustainability and governance. This allows both local and international finance and prepares for the basic conditions. And also we need more expertise to cut down costs on investments, and particularly to answer to clear-cut goals such as improving infrastructures and better suit them to climate risks. And this private engagement needs to have this expertise to subsequently be able to diversify and expand the spectrum of finance until it finally reaches the investments needed for the sector. And finally, here are some examples of types of support that we provide to enhance sustainability and creditworthiness. We have this throughout several countries, such as Angola, Mexico, and Peru. We are undertaking a lot of efforts to improve tariffs and how to adapt investments to new regulatory frameworks in Brazil as well as in Indonesia. And at last, we have a sound focus on attaining new technologies and efficiency mechanisms. As Thiago mentioned, macro and metering and gauging, which is very important for rendering these services in this service, and also for improving the cost relationship side of companies. With this, and just to round off, Luis, we can thus have a greater mobilization domestically, provide more solutions for both blended and granted concession investments, and also be able to diversify investments in order to reach other challenging sides and issues of both water and basic sanitation, which can also help to distribute and enhance the distribution of water sources. And so this is a final kind of chart flow of how we envision this new financing framework for the water and sanitation framework. So I'd like to thank everyone for their patience. Here, there are a couple of QR codes that you can access to read more about my presentation. Thank you very much.
Christian. Mais uma vez, uma contribuição também
Thank
muito
you very
importante
much,
sua, do
Christian.
Banco
Once
Mundial,
again,
que
very
realmente
important
sempre nos
contribution
traz
from
muita
you and the
novidade,
World
muita
Bank, always
informação,
bringing a lot of new
muito
information and
avanço nessas questões aí
novelties
de
and
estudos que o banco
headway
está
made in these
produzindo, né,
studies
elementos
conducted
novos aí
by the
também
bank,
para ampliação da capacidade de
new elements
investimentos.
to enhance
Acho muito
capacity of
interessante quando você fala
investments.
da
I found it really interesting
subvalorização da
when you
água,
said
acho que é um
about
negócio muito
how water is
importante e tem toda a
subvalued.
razão, acho que é uma
You're fully
discussão,
right on
né,
this,
até eu
and
sempre lembro de
I
um caso que
I
um
always
palestrante
recall
chega num
an
congresso
instance
da
in
água e
which
fala, olha,
a
a
speaker
garrafinha de 500 ml que você
at
está tomando de
a
água mineral
workshop says
custa
that
R$ 6
bottle that you're
e eu
drinking,
vendo um
it
metro
costs
cúbico
six
a
reais.
3,
However, I sell a cubic
tratado, né, com clorado em tudo.
meter of
Então,
treatable water
realmente
at
são
three
questões
reais. So these
muitíssimo
really
importantes que você está
are
trazendo
very
e acho que
pressing
isso
issues
sempre
that you brought
aflora
here
aí uma
today.
discussão muito importante.
And I think
Vou
this
passar rapidinho
renders
para as
a very
perguntas, porque nós
important
temos só 15
discussion.
minutos aí para
Now we only
finalizar a nossa
have
sessão.
15 minutes for
E
our
uma
final
primeira
Q&A
pergunta vem do
session. So the
Jefferson lá da
first
Sanepar aí pelo
question
chat.
from Jefferson through the
Que ele
chat,
pergunta assim,
and
como
he asked the
funciona o
following:
saneamento em outros
how does
países? É
financing work in other
responsabilidade municipal,
countries? Is it
estadual
a
ou federal?
municipal, state, or
Veja,
federal
eu até acho que vou
responsibility?
pedir para o professor
And
Júlio,
to this end,
Július
I'll
comentar
kindly
pouco da
ask
Inglaterra e
Professor
talvez
Julius to
da Europa,
perhaps
mas
comment
muito
on the United
rapidamente, viu,
Kingdom and
professor
Europe
Július, que nós
side,
estamos com
but
o tempo muito
very
estourado.
briefly,
Se
Professor,
puder ser
because we are
bem breve
very
na resposta,
short
aí, no
on
máximo um
time.
minuto,
So perhaps if
dois
you can just
minutos no
provide
máximo, por favor,
1 to a
só para dar
maximum
um
2-minute
panorama de como
response,
é
just to provide a
essa
general
prestação de serviço, a
overview on
regulação dos
this
serviços
rendering of
na Inglaterra e
services
talvez em outros países que você
in
possa nos
England and
iluminar.
perhaps in
Eu
other
tenho mais outras
countries,
4 perguntas aqui
because
para
there are 4
endereçar
other
ao
questions here that
Otaviano, ao Christian e ao próprio
I
Tiago.
have to
Obrigado.
address to our other panelists here. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's quite simple. It depends on the contract, and the contract is with reference to a project which is connected to a municipality or a county or a local authority. But broadly speaking, the government has to guarantee the contract. So we're talking about the risks. And investors will not invest unless that guarantee is in place. And in the British budgetary process, this is a conditional guarantee. It's a contingent liability on the state. And the British state has assumed hundreds of billions of dollars of these guarantees. Of course, payable at different times and different situations in different circumstances. So ultimately, the government has to underwrite the risks.
Perfeitamente. Muito obrigado,
Perfect.
professor,
Thank you, Professor,
pelas
for
contribuições.
your
Eu queria agora
answer,
fazer
for your contributions.
questionamento
I would now like
Otaviano.
to ask
Não é
Otaviano,
uma pergunta fácil, viu,
and
Otaviano?
this is
É uma
not an
pergunta
easy
muito
question,
difícil.
okay? I'll warn you in
Mas
advance.
certamente
But
você vai
I'm
contribuir
sure
muito.
that you'll
Na
have a
verdade,
lot of
nós estamos aí
contributions.
diante de um
And
cenário,
actually,
do
we
novo
are
marco
facing
legal, que é
a
a
new
universalização
legal
do serviço até
framework
o ano 2033. E nós estamos em
scenario
2024, menos de
up
10
to
anos aí
2023. So we have less
para
than
cumprir
10
essa
years to
meta de
fulfill these
universalizar.
new
O próprio
goals
Plano
of
Sábio, o Plano Nacional de Saneamento fala em
universalizing
investimentos
access to
acima de 500
water and
bilhões, alguma coisa do
sanitation
tipo,
with
para
investments of over
universalizar
$500
água e esgoto no
billion
país. E também nós
to
temos
provide access in the country
ODS, né? E a
to water and
ODS
sanitation.
6,
We have also
o
the
Objetivo de
Sustainable
Desenvolvimento
Development
Sustentável, de
Goals,
que fala do saneamento, que era a Agenda 1530, né?
which is the
Mas
1530
diante
agenda. But in light
cenário de
of this
universalização,
context
desse
of
grande desafio, como você
universalization, of this major
imagina
challenge, how do you
alavancar
imagine
os recursos? O que precisaria
that it'll be
destravar?
able
Ou o
to
principal, ou os principais
to
elementos
unlock
políticos,
the main
institucionais, regulatórios, enfim,
institutional and
econômicos, né,
regulatory
para que esse
aspects so that
processo, para que essa alavancagem aconteça de
this
fato, né?
leverage
Muita gente
is
é
actually able
incrédula em
to be
relação
fulfilled.
a
A lot
essa
of
questão
people
dos
do not
investimentos para se
believe
atingir a
these
universalização,
investments
né? Mas
can
será
be able to
possível
reach this
acreditar que realmente nós vamos
universalization. But do you really
tendo
think
os investimentos,
that we will
conseguiremos
have
atrair esses
enough
investimentos para o Brasil? O
investments?
Brasil tem
We'll be able to
capacidade
allure
para
these
absorver isso
investments. Brazil has a
nesses
need
menos de 10 anos
to take
até a
in these
universalização? Queria sua opinião a
investments
respeito.
within 10 years. I'd like to know your
Olha,
thoughts on the
é
matter.
evidentemente um desafio
Of course, this is a
brasileiro, no
major
sentido de que
challenge to the end that
uma mudança em
will
relação
be a change
ao cenário que vem
to
prevalecendo
the
nas últimas
scenario that
décadas. A
has
julgar pelo
prevailed in the
ritmo
last
nosso
decades.
das
If
décadas
we
anteriores, a gente
look at
não
the
chega lá,
previous
não tem
decades, we
como.
won't, there's no
Agora,
way of
tem
reaching
dois
this.
caminhos
However, there are two
complementares. Um
pathways
deles
that are complementary to each other. The
rever
first one
a composição do
is
gasto
to
público brasileiro,
reassess how Brazilian public
buscando
expenses
criar
are
espaço fiscal
dispersed,
para aumentar
trying to
a
make way
inversão
for
pública na
fiscal
área. Porque
way
mesmo com
space
algum sucesso
for
na
investments,
incorporação
because
do setor privado,
despite some
preciso ter
success
consciência de
in
que
the
não é
private
algum
sector, we need
substituto.
to be aware that this
É
is
mais
not a
complementar
replacement.
do que
This is
substituto.
more of a
Então, você tem
replacement than
encontrar
a
esse espaço
substitute.
fiscal
So we really
e
need to
rever,
find this fiscal
portanto,
space and therefore
aquilo que a gente está
reassess
aumentando. E aí, nesse
what
caso,
what we've been
o cenário
increasing.
básico
You
não
need
é
to
muito favorável.
reassess
A gente está chegando
the
numa situação
scenario,
em que
which
daqui a
isn't
2 anos, 3
favorable
anos, não vai ter
because in
sequer
2 or 3 years we won't
orçamento
even
disponível para
have
despesas
an available
discricionárias.
budget for discretionary
Então, acho que tem urgência em rever
budgets
isso.
and services. So I
E,
think
no
this
outro
is a
lado,
pressing need. And on the other
ao
hand,
mesmo tempo, ainda que os primeiros sinais depois da
even if the
aprovação
first
da lei
signs
tenham
after
sido até,
approval of the
tivemos boas
first
notícias, não é o caso de ficar
law have
mencionando esses vários
been
projetos.
provided
Então,
good signs,
mas é que
but still
o governo não pode fazer
the
barulho,
government
não
cannot
pode
make
colocar aquele aceno de
noise
risco de alteração de regras.
or change
A
norms and
estabilidade regulatória é
regulations,
algo, a
regulatory
percepção de que a regulação
stabilization,
é estável é
and
fundamental
this is really
para
key
diminuir a percepção de risco por parte de investidores
to
privados.
diminish
Acho
the
que
risk
são as
of
duas coisas que têm que
perceptions
ocorrer para
from
que
the
a gente
standpoint of
encaminhe a direção
investors.
de
So I think
resolver
this
o problema.
is
É um grande
required
desafio.
for us to resolve
Sem
this, which is
dúvida nenhuma,
a
o tamanho
major
do desafio não é
challenge.
nada pequeno.
Indeed, this is a
Mas de
huge
fato,
challenge.
por favor, complemente.
Please, any more
Não sei
thoughts?
se quer complementar alguma coisa.
Would you like to add
Achei
anything?
que você ia fazer algum
Okay, I
complemento.
thought you're going to add something.
Mas concordo plenamente
But
com
I
você sobre
do and fully
esse
agree with
tamanho desse
you
desafio.
on the size of
Eu
this
somente quero fazer
challenge.
Pois
I
não.
would just like
uma
to
contribuição menor aí,
add
porque no caso do
a
Brasil,
small thing. In the case of Brazil,
a tendência
I think
vai
the
por
trend,
bom caminho no sentido que o marco regulatório já
in the
cria
sense that the
condições
framework
muito
already
mais
provides for
com muito mais
conditions
claridade
that are much clearer
das
and
responsabilidades que tem
defined
cada dos
for responsibilities attributed
níveis
to
institucionais
each of
do
the
governo federal
institutional levels of the
até
federal
nível municipal.
government.
Então,
So
nós estamos olhando agora
we are looking at this
incremento
moment
nos
at an
investimentos do setor de
enhance
água,
of investments in water and
eu acho que sem a
sanitation.
lei não daria
But I think without the law,
para
this
investimento. Então,
this wouldn't be
a
possible for these
tendência
investments to take place. So I
andar
think
na
that
história
the
correta, eu
tendency
acho, para com as
is
mas
that
muito
we are on the
trabalho
right
tem que
path, but
ser
we still
feito
have
para
a
atingir
lot
os
of work
objetivos até
before us before we're able
2030,
to
34.
fulfill our goals for 30
Bom, tem uma
and
pergunta
34.
que eu também estou
I have a
endereçando aqui
question
para o Thiago e
here,
também a você, Christian, que
also
na
directed at
prática é a
you, Christian,
seguinte: a
and
gente tem
Thiago, which is the
desafio do
following. So we
investimento, como eu
have
disse também,
this
da
challenge of
universalização,
investments
e grande
regarding
parte das áreas que
universalization.
precisam ser atendidas ainda
Many of
nos
the fields
municípios são
that
as áreas
need to
vulneráveis,
be
né, as
catered to
favelas e
are
comunidades urbanas. A
vulnerable
gente chamava de aglomerados
areas. We
subnormal,
used
agora o
to call
IBGE
them
até mudou para
subnormal
favelas e comunidades urbanas.
conglomerates. Now they
São
have
as áreas
been
mais
changed
vulneráveis, de
this
fato, as
name.
áreas mais
They're
críticas, e
more
também nas
vulnerable
áreas rurais, que
areas and
nem
also
sempre tem aquela
critical
viabilidade
and
econômica
urban
para
areas.
os prestadores de serviço, para os investidores, né?
Sometimes they're
Ou
not
seja, é
feasible.
garantir o acesso a
So we want
populações
to ensure
dispersas, populações
access
em regimes
for
bem
those
mais
populations that are
complexos e
quite
vulneráveis e
dispersed
de uma
and that live
vulnerabilidade social
in
muito
a
grande.
much
Queria
higher
ouvir de
social
vocês, né,
vulnerability.
com a
I
experiência que
would
vocês
like to
têm
hear
dos
from you,
bancos, né,
based on your
como enfrentar
experience
esse
with the
desafio,
banks,
né,
how to
diante
face
dessa
this
de
challenge,
novamente dessa meta de universalização, como lidar com
considering
isso?
the
Qual a
universal
perspectiva de vocês como
access
agentes
target
financiadores diante
as
desse desafio?
funding agents.
Tiago,
How
por favor,
should we
começa você, depois eu
tackle
passo para o
this
Christian.
obstacle?
Rapidamente, por gentileza.
So,
Legal.
Tiago first and
E
then
difícil
Chris.
é responder essa
Well,
pergunta rapidamente,
it's
viu?
a tough question.
Pergunta
It's
chave.
not easily answered
Mas
in a couple of
vou
minutes.
dividir em duas partes rapidamente.
But
Tá? A
I'll
gente tem o
try
tema
to
das
break down
favelas,
my
que
answer.
são
Well,
mais
in
urbanas,
relation
né?
to
Nos centros
favelas in the
das cidades.
urban areas in
E aí nós
cities.
temos o caso que eu trouxe
Well, we
de
have this
projeto de
case that
saneamento
I
integral,
mentioned
onde a gente tem que
of
fazer
a
a
full
urbanização, né?
sanitation
Para atacar diversos problemas do saneamento,
project in
seja
which we
inundação,
have
drenagem,
to
seja água, seja
work
esgotamento
on
sanitário,
the
seja resíduos
urban
sólidos.
plan,
Ok?
including
Isso é
everything,
um jeito de
drainage,
atacar o problema,
soil
é muito
permeability. It's a way
interessante,
of
porque a gente melhora a
addressing
qualidade de vida
the
das pessoas, tem
problem that
impactos fenomenais nas cidades
increases
e nas pessoas
quality
e
of
nas
living and
comunidades. Né?
creates
Mas é
very
difícil,
positive effects in
é muito
communities.
complicado o tema do
But it's very
recenseamento
difficult.
sensível,
You know,
né? A gente tem
resettlement is
políticas bem
very
estruturadas quanto a
difficult.
isso, mas
There
é
are
difícil para os
some
municípios e estados também
established
atacar esse
policies
problema.
around this,
Uma outra
but
solução
it's
que eu vejo
difficult
como
for
mais
municipalities to
inovadora
deal with this.
para esse
I think
tema
that a more
é o que a
innovative
Sabesp fez
approach
recentemente, está sendo
is
muito
the
comentado no nosso planejamento,
example of
que são as licitações
Sabesp.
integradas lá no Rio
They
Pinheiros,
they
onde o BID
made
teve o prazer de
some
financiar também
tenders,
algumas dessas
integrated
licitações
tenders,
no âmbito do
tenders
programa
for
GT4,
areas in the Pinheiros
onde você não
River
faz o projeto, entrega
that
o
we
projeto para
funded,
uma empresa executar.
and
Você
it's not a project
estuda,
for a company
diagnostica
to
o problema,
execute. First of all,
determina como vai
you may a
medi-lo e deixa o
diagnostic,
mercado
you
fazer, bolar
measure
as
and
soluções,
assess the
desde que a
problem,
empresa
and then
aceite,
you
etc.
leave it
Claro que
up
isso com
to the
bons estudos e
market to
diagnósticos,
find the
né?
solutions.
Conseguiram aí resultados incríveis,
And the results
mudando a
were
ótica da
really
contratação, né? Mudando a
incredible.
ótica da
It was
solução
a
do
complete
problema.
turnaround
Então eu vejo que
in
isso
the
está
way the
sendo difundido e
problem
crescendo no
was
Brasil
addressed.
e com
I
certeza
think we
vamos
have
ter algumas
dispersed
outras.
communities as well.
Vou parar por aqui, eu vou passar a
I'll
palavra
stop
para
here and then I'll
o
turn
Christian,
it
não sei se
over
ele
to
quer comentar
Christian.
sobre essa
Christian, would you
pergunta.
like to say something?
No, muito rápido.
Just quickly, if I may.
O que o setor privado sempre tem que ver
Well,
com
the
estes
private
desinvestimentos em áreas
sector,
mais pobres é o que vai fazer
you
o
know,
governo para
the
reduzir o
private
risco
sector in relation
e
to
reduzir o custo de
poor
capital de
areas.
entrada.
Well, I would
Porque o
like the government
potencial
to
é
reduce risk and
muito
reduce
elevado
the
por o
cost
número
of
das pessoas
the
que podem
starting
ter
capital because the
potencialmente
risk is very
este
high,
serviço e que com uma
considering the
estratégia
number
a
of
longo
people
prazo
that will benefit
não
from this
podem
service.
somente
And
integrarse à rede
because with a
de
long-term strategy,
serviço,
not
mas
only they
também
will be
contribuir
incorporated into the service
financeiramente
networks, but they will
ao
also make
mantenimento da rede do serviço. E
financial
isso é algo que evidências
contributions
muito
to
forte,
maintain the
muito
network.
clara a nível
And
global.
this is something
A gente
that's
paradoxicamente,
supported
a
by
gente com menor
evidence.
renda
It's a paradox.
tem a pagar mais
People with
por
higher
serviços de água,
income
tem a ter uma valoração muito maior de lo
value
que é a água e
value
serviços de
water
esgoto. Então,
and sewage
eu
services
acho que o potencial fica aí,
in a much
tem
greater
volume,
proportion. So
muito
there is a
volume de
potential, there
pessoas
is a
que
lot
podem
of
contribuir.
volume as
Mas a
well
chave é
of
o que
people
vai
who
fazer o
may
governo
become contributors to
para
the
reduzir
system.
o
But
risco,
the question is, what will
para
the
reduzir o
government
custo de
do to
entrada
reduce
no setor privado e que vai fazer,
risks
que vai
and
comprometer-se o setor
upfront
privado
costs
a
as
prover
well,
de serviços de
which
maneira
is
sustentável
keeping the
estas zonas
private sector away
empobrecidas.
from sustainable
Muito
initiatives.
obrigado, Christian.
Thank you very
Bom,
much,
eu só tenho a
Christian.
agradecer a todos aqui.
Well,
Brilhantes
my
colocações.
thanks
Acho um
goes to
tema
all of you.
muitíssimo importante.
It's a very
Sempre as
important
contribuições de
topic,
vocês abrilhantam aí o
and
evento e
your
todo o
contributions
nosso
are
esforço em
really
trazer elementos novos, trazer contribuições
just
importantes.
just brilliant. And once again, my gratitude in the name of ABS to both to Julio, Christian, Thiago. Great contributions. You're always invited to participate in the ABS discussions.
Avançam e progridem e prosperam muito aí no setor de saneamento como
and these are hot topics for the sanitation industry, and they are sources of inspiration for service providers, economic agents, public agents, the civil society, the academic sector. ABS is today a reference, the most important reference, I would say, because of the contributions in the development of public policies and guidance for a very qualified discussion of sanitation. I would like to inform you that the next session of Brazil Water Week will take place tomorrow at 9. We'll talk about monitoring and forecast of critical events. And in the backdrop of the Rio Grande do Sul crisis, I think it's very important for us to watch those sessions. Thank you once again. Have a great afternoon, everyone.